momentarily for class solidarity. Cash circulating, give the masses back its currency. Greed from elites, oligarchs stay fed. Deep state, faith fed, everybody break bread. Racism, homophobia, sexism, religion in this melting pot we live in. Time to build a new system, unionize labor rights. Highlight the issue, talking heads left is best. The saga continues. The Nomiki Show.
Hello and welcome to the Nomiki Show. I am Nomiki Cons. It is Femme Friday, and I think you can probably tell at this point that my voice is a little shot. So as a result, I am not going to do a monologue today. I am going to really just take it easy, nice and slow this weekend. But that doesn't mean I'm not going to provide some content for you guys. We have a really great interview today. We are very excited. I've been looking forward to this. There's a new series out in The Intercept by investigative reporter Sharon Lerner. She has uncovered a lot about the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and you can check out her series in The Intercept right now, where she was able to be in touch with some whistleblowers who spoke out about the EPA's practice of, quote, routinely approving dangerous chemicals. But with that, I am very excited to welcome Sharon Lerner to the show. Is Sharon ready?
I am. Hi.
Hi, Sharon. Thank you so much for joining us today. I apologize for my voice. I'm trying all I can. So this is really fascinating. I'm curious, how did this come about? Did a whistleblower come to you?
Yeah. So first, thanks for having me on. This goes back almost a year ago. I have been doing this series since July. But the first story is in July, but researching it even before then. And yes, I was contacted by a number of whistleblowers who work in the EPA's Division of New Chemicals, and their job is to make sure that the chemicals are safe before they hit the market. And what they told me in short was that they were facing a lot of pressure to make chemicals seem safer than they actually were. So if they identified hazards, often their managers or supervisors were saying, you need to change that, or they were challenging their assessments. And they were sometimes, even if they refused to change them, the assessments were being changed without their knowledge or their permission. So this was not just one occasion, but a bunch. And they ended up filing complaints with the EPA Inspector General. And then after a while, they came to me and told me their story in short and shared documents with me. So, and I should say they shared their accounts with me and the Inspector General and occasionally some members of Congress.
So I'm curious, were these whistleblowers all working together, or was this happening sort of on an individual basis?
So sometimes they were working together, and there were, I spoke with 5, and several of them did work together as colleagues in this division. All but one, I believe, have since been moved out. And that's part of the alarming thing that we've seen, is that they called attention to this and basically lost their positions within the agency. And I'm sorry, I shouldn't say within the agency, they lost their positions with the division. They were kind of moved to other positions in the EPA. And part of what's been really troubling and problematic is, they submitted not just, again, to me, but to the Inspector General. And these are these big documents that they've shared with us that include screenshots of emails that they are, reports being edited, all sorts of evidence. And I've also interviewed them for hours and hours and hours. Mm-hmm. So these are not allegations that have been made lightly. They're really well documented. And in fact, in my last story, I actually included some of the actual documents before I've done just kind of screenshots or little bits of them. In this last story, I think I included 4 of the documents to give a sense of the kind of how much information is in there, how detailed it is, and how these are not kind of, oh, my boss told me to change something. It's, on this day I wrote that it was based on this chemical, which I'm, the structure, which is like this, and and it has these particular known effects, and its closest relative, it's incredibly detailed, and you can look in the last piece. Again, I've linked them at the bottom, where you can really see, wow, these are serious charges. So the inspector general is still considering these allegations, is reviewing them. And part of what's really difficult and strange about this story is that basically, as I mentioned, the people who made the allegations have been removed from their positions, but the people who are at the center of these incidents that are really well described remain in their positions, except one of them left. And so it's really a very delicate situation over there.
So I have a couple questions, and maybe you can just bring them all into one. The whistleblowers, I assume these are scientists.
Yes, they're all PhD scientists, toxicologists for the most part, but people who have expertise in chemistry and biochemistry and toxicology.
Now, they're the people who they were, they're the people they were reporting to. Were they political? Or are they managers? Or were they also scientists?
They're also scientists. Some of them are they're higher up. One of them was the science advisor. Another one is sort of the director above them in that division.
Now, I assume that this may have, I just assume, but I could be wrong, so please prove me wrong. This is sort of a shift that happened over Trump. This sort of, the way he gutted the EPA, as we know. So I'm curious. This seems, listen, the EPA is not perfect, as we all know, but this seems a little jarring.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right that there was this really intense shift at the EPA during the Trump administration. And it was a little bit, I think of it as sort of a standing on its head. You had people who, from the industries, who were regulated, pretty much running the actual, in each department. You had the people from, who used to represent the air polluters, running the air division and such. And a lot of the problems did intensify, the problems that I'm describing here. And obviously, I should just say this is a really redacted document. And we tried to, some of them are less redacted, but there are pieces that we couldn't make public.
Yeah.
But so there was an intensification under Trump, and that's absolutely true. But what I've been writing about has all been since. And so these problems have continued, the problems of kind of, again, sort of making these changes and feeling this pressure at the behest of industry. And I would say that the people at the heart of the matter that have been there for years and years. So it's really, there weren't Trump appointees. It was just an intensification of pressure during the past administration that has not been resolved.
And did the people, the folks who were brought in by Trump, who were part of the industries that they were supposed to be regulating, are they still at the EPA?
Well, so the political appointees for the most part left. Yeah. So that was, and you see that with every change of administration, the whoever's in charge, the president brings in his own folks. And generally speaking, you've got, especially with, the Trump administration, it was really, I think, the most extreme from what I understand in terms of industry representation, for sure. And most of those folks are gone. Yes. But in this part, this new chemicals part and the part of the EPA that looks at both new and old chemicals, it's one of the divisions that's really struggled to kind of maintain its integrity, because what it's doing is regulating an intensely powerful and profitable industry, right? And whether your chemical comes onto the market or not and what restrictions it has matters a lot to the manufacturers, right? And often what happens is if the manufacturers aren't happy, if their chemical is not getting approved or is not getting approved as quickly as they'd like it to, what happens, and I've reported on this in the second and third pieces of this, I believe, series, is that they'll call on their elected officials and they'll say, hey, can you reach out to the EPA and make sure my chemical gets moved along? And these, in this case, and we've got a lot of documentation in this, I believe it's the second story, about that internally they call these hair on fire cases. And so hair on fire is when oh, we got to get to this right now because someone's pissed, right? And so we have this audio recording in there. I don't know if you can actually play when we're on the air, but you can hear the consultant. They brought in a consultant to kind of redo their internal software, and they wanted to basically include a green button, a single button that would make it possible for the managers to basically override the concerns of the scientists with a single button, right? And this is in hair on fire cases. And here, when you're scrolling here, right there, that if you look closely, that green is HOF duty. That's hair on fire duty. And what that was is like a rotating, some manager was always in charge of hair on fire because some companies at any point will come and be mad and say, you guys got to get on this. You got to move. Well, the hair on fire duty person was responsible for those cases. Yeah. And
let's play this. I think we can play it. David, we're able to, right?
Yeah, try.
So going back to the flags again,
Sure.
Is there a way to override it all? So for example, say there are 9 open discussions, but then we suddenly had to expedite a case due to some hair on fire situation. Do we need 9 people to go in and close out these discussions for it to move forward? Or is there an all-powerful person like can come in and override everything?
And then let's play the second one.
Like a button or something, and then we'll assign whoever that person or persons may be to override everything.
Okay, override meaning that this turns to green.
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
So
does that make sense?
Yes. and does this I'm just curious, like, are these chemical companies that get their people in, is there a lot? I mean, I am very confused about just like how the process of this, I get it in Congress, it's obvious, but how is the process of this really carried out fully, especially since this is an agency that has a lot of long time, folks who've been working there and they have their own, cultural norms. I imagine that there's been a lot of friction internally.
Well, I mean, I think that's what we're seeing. This whole series is really, it is about this friction. It's about these internal disputes. The problem is that the EPA has kind of treated this as like an internal dispute, right? That this is like, okay, we have 2 different, 2 employees who are disagreeing with one another, right? But PEER, which is it's an environmental organization that is representing the whistleblowers in this case, is really arguing the point that it's not really just he said, she said, or he said thing. These are incredibly well documented cases. For instance, the audio that you just heard that lays out with pretty incontrovertible evidence this pattern of influence, right? And so it's not just about like, oh, I believe this and you believe that, and it's a sort of, you could go either way scientific point. It's actually something bigger. And so the dispute that's kind of happening now, I think, is that PEER really wants the folks who are named in these disclosures and in the incidents they've described to me, they want them out of their positions, right? Because they want they want this influence to stop, and they don't feel like it has. And I think EPA feels like we really need to hear the inspector generals. We want to hear what they say before we do anything to change personnel, right? And so you can see it's like a pretty meaty dispute. And what the whistleblowers would say and have said to me is like, the reason that they came forward, and I should say that they came forward at real risk to themselves, and it has been a very bumpy ride for them. You know, they've lost their positions, and you know, they've been public. They actually wanted me to use their names, and I did. And so now you can Google them, you can find them. They and everyone in the agency knows who they are, and that's like a really intense thing to do. And why would anyone do that? And I've asked them, why would you do this? It's because they really felt like there was danger to the public health, that we are breathing these things, and that they felt like they had to stop it. And that, you know, these are people who went to the EPA because they really were concerned about protecting people from chemicals. And they were lying awake at night feeling that they knew something was happening and that it really had huge consequences, and that they needed to come forward out of like an obligation, you know? And so when you look at, you know, some of the chemicals we're talking about, in one case, it's like a paint, you know, and so there's a spray paint that is about half of, it's by weight, half of this product is a known carcinogen. And the folks, the whistleblowers, wanted to be able to assess, to mention that in the assessment, that basically half of this stuff is this known carcinogen, and it's a well-established carcinogen that's been recognized by the state of California. And they ended up there, the manager said, you know, no, you that's not the way you do it. And they said, okay, well, they were debating this sort of process point, you know, and they said, okay, we can't do it this way. Can we alert people another way? No, you can't do that either. And so it's this really feeling like, oh my gosh, we have this consequential, really important information, and we're trying, it's our job to alert the public, and we can't. And so I think that's when you end up with a situation where people really put themselves in this terrible spot, personally and professionally, to get this message out. And I think I mentioned I started my first piece in this series was in July. It's March now. So for the better part of a year, they've been kind of dangling and under this really intense pressure, and this is not resolved. And the people who they've named and brought attention, you know, to their actions remain in place. So it's a very difficult situation.
And let's talk about the inspector general. Who is this? How are they appointed, or how do they earn this position? And when do we expect to report back?
You know, I've asked them when they expect to report back, and they won't tell me. And they won't make this kind of thing public. There's just no response. But you know, presumably they've had them for a long time. I hope that answer is coming soon. And I mean, I should say that in the meantime, the EPA has made some changes, and I did do a piece about that as well. I think it's maybe 4 or 5, but where, you know, they've made some structural changes, added some positions, created a position and created 2 kind of bodies within the agency that will be paying attention to the scientific integrity in these areas and trying to check on it. And I feel like these are good steps. But it seems like it's, here, right. So yeah, this lays out some of the changes that they made.
This is an article, just for the audio. It's EPA plans to clean up troubled chemicals and pesticide programs. It's an article. It's part 5 of the series. I'm curious, did any of the companies or the chemicals associated maybe with specific companies, do they respond? Have they acted out? Is there any sort of
It's
acknowledgement of
such a
this?
good question. And the answer is complicated and weird because, well, it is, because you would think, so I mentioned the paint chemical. That chemical is not made specifically by one company. It's kind of an old chemical that's been around for a long time. And all the products that they're assessing, that they're writing about in these disclosures, complaints to the IG, right? They're all submitted to the EPA as confidential business information.
Okay.
And if the whistleblowers were to reveal any of this confidential business information, they would be at an even greater threat. Like they could face criminal penalty. So I don't know the names of the products or of the companies that make them. I can only say a lot about them, the type, as much as I can, which is why when you see these redacted documents, and it's one of the reasons it's been kind of bananas to report on this, because there's so much you can't say legally. But to take a couple of steps back and think about this is how we remain so in the dark. So much of chemical regulation has really been just locked down by the companies who are very involved in writing the regulations, right? They're lobbyists and folks. So CBI is a big deal at EPA, and by law, they cannot
CBI is
reveal.
what?
Oh, CBI, meaning confidential business information, is a very big deal at EPA. And it makes it so hard as a reporter to write about these things in a way that anyone understands, right? Because so we and also to check up on it, right? What is this product and who is being exposed? Well, I can't even, this is really, I want to talk about that screenshot in a sec, but it's so hard to figure out because it's all confidential and locked down. When you try to look up, okay, how much of this is produced and where, and I've gone through this database so many times, how much is produced, CBI, name of the facility, CBI, amount, CBI, or like, just what it's used for, CBI, whether it's exported, CBI, so we don't know. And so in cases like the case of the paint I talked about, that's, we do know that people are being exposed. The extent to which a lot of these other things, we're exposed to these other things, it's a big black box. Although I should say some of the chemicals we know are emitted at manufacturing plants where we know that the people surrounding the plants generally are low income and folks. Do you want to bring that screenshot?
Yeah, before we get to that, just for a second, because on that topic, is there any scenario in which, I mean, I assume you're not a lawyer or not, practice anything related to this, but I'm curious, like, because some of this stuff was released, some of this was, through your reporting has been leaked. Could you imagine a scenario in which they can at least prove that there's been an immediate sickness due to use of these products? Obviously cancer is a complicated thing. You can't necessarily target, but maybe there is something like if somebody's a painter and they're using one paint or whatever, that there could be potentially a lawsuit against the government for not regulating it when they were consciously aware.
Well, I can imagine it, but it's so hard. And, not only the confidentiality stuff I talked about, but another thing I've reported on quite a bit is the relationship between cancers and exposures and in situations like in cancer clusters. It is so hard to definitively prove a link between exposure and illness under the best of circumstances. And in
Love Canal, there's always precedent.
Right. But that was a humongous struggle that took years and years and years and years. So, which isn't to say, I mean, there are a lot of cases happening now, and particularly, with pesticides, you see there are Roundup cases with, there certainly are, but it's a huge lift.
Right.
So
let's go back to there was this health here we go. It's a human health summary. Is it possible to zoom in on that a little bit, David, just so we can read a little bit closer? I have to put my glasses on.
Yeah. Okay. So the part, perfect. Oh, a little down. Yeah. So if you go down a little bit, right? So it says, based on the hazard determination and available quantitative and qualitative risk information, EPA concludes that and then did not identify risk for a chemical substance. So it was actually, let me go down to the later part, and I'm going to bear with me for a second, but it's a really fascinating edit. So what we're looking at here is track changes in the assessment of a chemical. Perfect. That's perfect the way you have it. Okay. And so the original, so what's in black and then what was eventually struck out was written by a scientist who authored this assessment, right? And what they end up saying is absorption of this chemical, which I'm not going to attempt to pronounce. And they talk about absorption through the lungs, moderate through the GI tract, through the skin, blah, blah, blah. For the for the new chemical substance, sorry. All right. So this is the one that's the car paint, right? So the new chemical substance contains more than half of this thing. And it says, which they call here the residual component. For the residual component, EPA identified dermal sensitization and systemic effects and cancer as hazards. Okay, so we've got dermal sensitization, systemic, which is lung, kidney, liver, and adrenal gland effects, and cancer are the three hazards, right? EPA identified, okay, we don't need to worry about that. And then it says, and then the last sentence is, EPA qualitatively evaluated a dermal sensitization, and then all that struck out, and in its place, it just says, for the new chemical substance, EPA did not identify a hazard. So we've said, the original said that it had systemic effects, right, on the lung, on the kidney, right, and on the adrenal gland and cancer, right? And now it says it didn't identify a hazard. And so imagine it's your job. It's your job, to protect the public from the health effects of hazardous chemicals. That's your job, right? That's what you've gone to school for many years to do. That's what you want to do with your life. And that's what you get up every morning in the day to do, right? And you do what you are supposed to do according to your job description, and you lay that out. And then you go to bed thinking you've written that, and you wake up to realize that someone scratched out your work and said, no, there's no hazard.
It's even a form of dignity. It's not even, I mean, obviously there's a public health issue, and there are people whose jobs might be to paint every day and aren't even aware of the risks, or they might be using one paint or another because they think it's a little safer. But this person wakes up dedicated to doing this, and it's dignity too. I can imagine it's quite a gut punch.
Right. And so you mentioned the person who's going to paint. You know, one of the frustrations is very hard to actually ban a chemical. Is very a rare thing, right? But what happens at the very least is that, you know, if a paint is a carcinogen, you might get a you know, at least a label saying this is carcinogenic. And maybe if you're working in, let's say, a car detailing shop, which is one of the places that uses this kind of stuff, you might wear a mask, you know, or, you know, but you're not going to do it if you don't know that it's a problem. And so, yeah.
I mean, what's so fascinating about this work, though, is on one hand, it's very hard to prove where cancer comes from and you know, what specifically caused a cancer. But on the other hand, reading the details of what they're reporting, like they're very clearly reporting on the effects of these chemicals and specific, you know, it's just, I'm actually with specificity that I'm kind of surprised by.
Yeah, it is super specific. And some of these documents that I get are, you know, 40 pages. They're like, so they're only like, I'm super condensing them because, you know, one, it's incredibly hard to understand just because it's so detailed. But yeah, no, this is, as I said, it's not sort of off the cuff. These allegations aren't lightly made.
So do you have much more in the series, or are you continue? I assume, sometimes when you report on these things, more people come out and come forward, but
yeah, I probably will, yes, and I again eagerly await the IG's findings.
right.
In the meantime, as as there is more information, I'll put it out, and people like, I desperately want to be fair to everybody involved in this situation. And I know that a lot of people at EPA are doing are trying to right a ship that was like upside down, but I really feel like, to the extent that this is still going on, it needs to be addressed immediately. And I feel, of course, for the whistleblowers, but I feel more for the rest of us who, it really shakes the confidence in our federal government to read these things. And, as I have really thoroughly, it makes me, feel really sad and unsure. I have very little confidence right now about the ability of our government to protect us from these things.
Great thing to go into the weekend with. No, I mean, come on, this is. I imagine you're also under pressure as well. I mean, being an investigative reporter is not easy. Have you had anybody retaliate? The government respond? Is anybody, or any of the I can't even imagine the companies that you haven't listed them, but has there been any sort of response to your piece from anybody in government or otherwise?
Well, I mean, the EPA has again made some changes, and I think this is just very contentious stuff. I've heard from a lot of people, and I have heard from some other people who left EPA and feel that, I've got a lot of emails that are that's the tip of the iceberg kind of a thing. And then I've heard from people saying EPA is, they're trying, and it's systematically what they have to do, their job in terms of regulating a tremendous industry and trying to, there are more chemicals, there are more than 40,000 chemicals in use, and they're like this little underfunded agency trying to make sense of it, and it is beyond daunting, and I very much get that. But I think ultimately, for the people who care about this stuff, who act, as much as these parts of the EPA are really in battle right now, I think that that most of the leadership at EPA wants to do the right thing, I think, and to clean this up. So I remain hopeful, and which isn't exactly what you asked me, but I'm happy to do the work, and don't worry about me.
Don't worry about it. Sharon Lerner, thank you so much for doing this work. It's worrisome, but you got to do the work, and this is how hopefully we'll reform these things. But really appreciate your time and your patience with my voice. You can check out Sharon Lerner's multi-part series. It's 8 right now, 8 parts, I believe. It's in The Intercept. It's titled EPA Exposed. We'll put it up on a link, in all the comment sections of all the different platforms we're on. So you can take a look at them. There's documents there. There's recordings. It's a really fascinating series. And thank you, Sharon, for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Feel better.
Thank you. Take care. Talk to you a little bit about Sunset Lake CBD. I know you guys love Sunset Lake CBD because I get messages from people about Sunset Lake CBD. I just got a new order. I'm so excited because there's a new gummy out, one that has melatonin in CBD, like that tincture I use at night. I just can't eat like 6 of them at once. Like last night, I had 2 glasses of wine and then I popped a gummy and then another gummy and then I felt like a zombie. But it was great for sleep because I do have sleep issues. Sunset Lake CBD is, of course, a farmer-owned company that ships their craft CBD directly from their farm in Vermont to your door. They have all types of different products. They have tinctures, they have fudge, they have dog biscuits. They have, you can get a joint, of course. It's just CBD, no THC at all, which is great because if you just want to calm down or relax without getting that high, this is the product for you. That is perfect for me too, because I can still focus. I can still, unwind from the news cycle and not feel the anxiety. There's also coffee with CBD in it, so you don't get jittery. It wakes you up, but you're not jittery. And the alternative to that is the melatonin with the CBD, which helps you go to sleep and stay asleep. I love the products. My family loves the products. I know many of you do. And if you are interested, go check out sunsetlakecbd.com and you will get 20% off of your order. When you type in NOMI, N-O-M-I, you will get 20% off of your entire order at sunsetlakecbd.com. Trust me, it ain't your typical CBD. I am telling you, it is the best. Go check it out. All right, we will be right back after this quick break. We're going to be talking with Amy Westervelt. All right, welcome back to the Nomiki Show. Amy Westervelt is an investigative reporter, journalist, and host of the Drilled podcast and co-host of Hot Take and Scene On podcast. She's also the co-founder and executive producer of Critical Frequency, a podcast production company. And Amy, you are on the oil beat. Oh my gosh, what a depressing beat to be on. Can I just start with that? I'm reading your pieces and I'm like, great to read this after last week. It just makes me feel we're not in denial at all.
Yeah, it's bad news lately, I have to say. I there's not a lot of ways to spin it. Yeah.
Well, I'd love to leave people with hope. But I mean, the more people know, obviously, the more activated they get. You have a couple pieces out in The Intercept in covering, oil production and how the IPCC, which is this governing body, and I'm going to ask you a bit about that in a second, really hasn't, doesn't have the teeth in the international community that we probably wish they would, and that has to do with industry involvement. So let's start with IPCC, because I think a lot of folks may have heard that for the first time when this report came out, basically saying, we're doomed. Enjoy your last days. What is the IPCC and how did you touched on this in the piece, but how did they form?
Yeah, so the IPCC is this group of scientists and researchers from all over the world that was formed by the UN back in the 90s. So there was this kind of the first big international climate conference was in Rio in 1992. And at that conference, they created the UN Framework on Climate Change. And then out of that came this IPCC body that sort of, it's kind of this like oversight body for all of the climate research. And they put out these reports every 4 years-ish. Sometimes it's like shorter, sometimes it's longer, but around every 4 years. And what they're supposed to do is sort of summarize the state of the research. Here's what we know. And then also here's what we know about what we could do about it. And the big problem, in my opinion, about both the UNFCCC and the IPCC is that they've allowed industry in there from jump. There were industry folks in Rio in 92. There were industry folks helping to draft like the framing documents that all this stuff is based on. And still today, there are industry folks who are authors of this report.
So when you say industry folks, I think what my in the US, we have a lot of industry folks getting involved, but our campaign system is what makes them so powerful. We have our
Right.
campaign finance system is a joke. You can lobby. Oftentimes you'll find sneaky ways for oil executives to get their, have their influence on our policies. But the UN doesn't accept that kind of money. And I assume the IPCC doesn't either.
Right.
Neither does the EU. So how are they able to influence and get on these committees? And I'm going to add one more thing. If you could kind of just describe, I'm sure you're familiar with like how oil companies will often get involved in the research by funding it and going to different universities, et cetera, like how that may impact this report as well.
Yeah, that all plays a part. So, I mean, in this case with the IPCC and sort of the UN framing stuff, basically, as soon as countries first started to meet and talk about environmental issues internationally in general, so like before climate change, you have them all meeting in Stockholm in the early 70s, right? And this thing called the Stockholm Convention comes out of that. And it is the least business-friendly document these guys have ever seen. And they're just like, oh shit, we gotta get a hold of this process, because we just sort of thought it would be, who cares? But now we're realizing that these international bodies might actually have some sway and some influence. And so heading into Rio in 92, in the lead up to that, they are meeting with various government representatives. The guy who ends up overseeing the Rio Earth Summit was actually a former oil executive from Canada. So he's very into the idea of business being part of the solution. And there's this particular guy, E. Bruce Harrison, who was a publicist for the chemical industry. He kind of was the guy tasked with dealing with Rachel Carson's book back in the 70s.
What's that?
Silent Spring. Yeah. So this guy who, is kind of helping various industries deal with environmental regulations for a long time, he sort of sees all of this stuff coming and he helps to organize industry's response to it. And what he learned from the Rachel Carson incident is that just saying regulation is bad won't work. They sort of lost that battle, right? Like in the wake of Silent Spring, you have the passage of the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and the formation of the EPA and all of that stuff. So he's like, okay, we can't do that. That's not going to work. What we need to do is present ourselves as part of the solution. And this is like the most toxic idea that gets into this whole process, because you still have so many people today who are very much convinced that you have to have, quote unquote, all stakeholders at the table and everybody needs to agree. And I don't know, I call it toxic civility. I just think it's like, look, people have like shown absolutely no evidence of ever negotiating in good faith on this stuff. And it's been 34 years. It's time to like get real and kick them out. So anyway, that's the problem, is that they've kind of been there since the beginning. They've really convinced a lot of people, including in the UNFCCC. I mean, Christiana Figueres is the head of the UNFCCC, and she invited just last year Shell's CEO to like the event that they had before the COP in Glasgow. So like,
I was there for that, weirdly enough.
It was amazing.
It was the protest. Yeah,
the activist that was like,
TED conference for folks. Weirdly enough, it was incredible and powerful, because you had a lot of climate activists, young climate activists, specifically the local climate activists, who were opposing a pipeline that Shell was drilling. They had the CEO on stage as well as Amazon CEOs, where we protested them. It was totally ridiculous. This is a climate summit.
Yeah, they have no place there. And I mean, there's been research, a lot of research in the last couple of years, including this paper that I wrote about for The Intercept, that shows very clearly that, industry saw the international negotiations particularly as a huge threat. So like, I think there's been a lot of focus in the past on what they were doing in the US, which yes, they were absolutely fighting against regulation, but the US guys were actually more worried about international policy because it wasn't as captured as US, you know?
Yeah, because you don't have lobbying, because you can't, there's no money in politics. They actually do have a regulatory, you know, and they're not afraid of regulation in the EU, for instance. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I think, and I mean, there was a peer-reviewed study earlier this year that showed that none of the oil companies are doing anything to actually comply with their net zero bullshit. So the idea that like they need to be involved and they're an important part of the solution or whatever, no, that it's just not true. It's not backed up by any evidence, and we have decades of it.
Right. Well, let's go back to that, because you know, there's this question of over whether or not they're climate denial, they're in denial, or they're just basically delaying. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, I gotta say, I mean, I reported on sort of the origins of climate denial for a long time, and then I kind of came to this point where I was like, this doesn't make sense. Like that, this being the sole strategy doesn't make sense, because like, please point me to the time in U.S. history when we were remarkably science-based in our policymaking. Yeah, not a thing, you know? The more I looked at it, the more I was like, you know, science denial was a piece of their strategy at a particular time. They figured out that that would be helpful, but the bulk of their strategy has always been wrapping American identity up in, you know, big houses and big cars and freeways and consumption and all of these things that require more and more and more fossil fuels. And like, kind of in conjunction with that is massively taking over the study of economics. So you mentioned university funding before. Fossil fuel companies have funded many of the economists who've come up with the models that people point to today in order to say, oh, it's too expensive to act on climate change. You know, they also like have been very, very fundamental in pushing, you know, ideas about free market capitalism and how fundamental it is to American identity and to freedom and all of these things. There's a significant amount of documentation of what they were doing post World War II to make sure that, you know, any kind of government intervention that was okay during the war is no longer okay, and to really foment the Cold War. So that stuff to me seems, it's much more insidious, and it's not that they're now shifting their tactics away from denial and to delay. It was always delay, and denial was like a piece of that, but it was always, you know, we need to stave off any kind of regulation as long as possible to make profit. Same old story, you know. I think, and yeah, to do that, they really they took over economics. They took over a lot of like cultural politics and identity stuff that is very baked into how Americans now, or a lot of Americans now, see things. So it's like, I don't know, they did it so well and for so long that they don't even need to do it that much anymore. They just have to like push on those buttons, you know?
Right.
They're going to take your hamburgers. They're going to take your freedom, you know?
Exactly. It's bizarre. I mean, if you ever turn on, which I hope you don't, but if you ever turn on like Fox Business, they discuss climate change. It's very bizarre. Yeah. They're acknowledging it. But then they, you know, it's conflicting. It's more from an economic perspective, but then you put on Fox News and it's like, you know, monster truck rallies and whatever the heck that they're discussing, like we're taking our way for our, you know, to save the polar bears. It's super interesting, the different conversations that they have on the different platforms. How do oil companies like greenwash? Just, I mean, I know this is a big space, but help us understand sort of their methodology and where we might even be tricked.
They right now are very focused on these like net zero promises that they've made, which don't mean anything. I mean, they're, in some cases, they're only looking at their own operational emissions, which is like 10% of the overall emissions that they're responsible for. So it's like, it's negligible. The big thing is just to invest in technologies that basically enable the status quo. So they're very invested in carbon capture right now, which so far has only been used for something called enhanced oil recovery, which is basically like you shoot carbon in the ground to get more oil out. It's not like a climate solution, but that's their big play right now. They are also very invested in, like algae-based biofuels. A lot of them are looking at hydrogen now because that is tied in with the gas industry, which they're all also invested in. So it's usually the things that they're investing in are things that do not require any kind of change to the combustion engine, because that would mean massive infrastructure change away from fossil fuels. Anything that can use existing pipeline infrastructure, grid infrastructure, they're very into. And anything that enables them to keep producing fossil fuels without stopping, which honestly, in this administration, they don't even need to bother.
Explain that, because now this big conversation about not that we've been dependent on Russian oil, but the EU in particular, they've pulled away from gas, and now I believe Poland is the one country that's really blocking the EU from getting off of Russian oil. We of course are not dependent on Russian oil, but I heard I heard Biden say yesterday that the reasons why gas prices are up and inflation is up is because of Putin. And I'm like, no. Why can't you say the word CEO? Is there anything? They're allergic to this, but I'm not saying that war does not impact oil costs for lots of different reasons, especially if you're in Europe.
Right.
But
right.
Don't we control a lot of our own oil? Like this is such a bizarre space, because you see stuff on TV and then you read it on in the news, and it's very different what's coming out of his mouth versus what you're reading in most newspapers.
Yeah. So this is actually really interesting because it gets to the sort of climate disinformation stuff too. As soon as Putin invaded Ukraine, and even like a couple of weeks before, the oil industry was immediately out there setting this narrative of, this is why we need more U.S. oil production, because now our gas prices are going to go up. And it's all the fault of Biden and the climate left. So they've really they've pivoted their messaging just in the last year from greenwashing and, all of that stuff to now what you're seeing. There's some research coming out later this month that looked at what exactly they were messaging on social media and right-wing media during this time. And it's like full culture war. It's like climate policy is the realm of the woke left. Biden cares more about climate activists than he does about real Americans, and really pushing this narrative of, the high prices at the pump are because of Biden's climate policies in particular. That was like a thing that they were just beating people over the head with. And none of it's true. And none of the things that the Biden administration is now doing to, totally in reaction to this messaging from the industry, not at all to do with what would actually help. None of it would help. It's all long-term stuff. You don't build an LNG export terminal in a month. That takes years. Even if they were to massively increase production in existing rigs and oil wells and use existing infrastructure to export more to the EU, that wouldn't have any impact on our gas prices, A, and B, the reason it's irritating to me, because the whole reason that we're beholden to global forces when it comes to price at the pump is because the industry pushed to lift the export ban in 2015. So because of the fracking boom and because those guys had too much gas stockpiled, they pushed for the administration to lift the export ban that had been in place since the 70s, which allowed them to engage in global markets, and it made all of us beholden to global commodity pricing. That's why prices are high at the pump. It has absolutely nothing to do with Russia, Ukraine, except that the Russia-Ukraine stuff has spurred some volatility in the market. But it's totally decoupled from actual supply and demand. It has nothing to do with it. And I don't know why the Biden administration can't just say that.
It's really bizarre to me. I think I completely agree with you, because it doesn't hurt him. It actually just fights back against right-wing messaging It's bizarre.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
remind folks why we had this export ban.
So back in the 70s, there was a sort of similar situation, right? We had an oil crisis in the U.S. because of United States support of Israel in the Israel-Arab War. The Arab oil-producing countries in OPEC put an embargo on sending oil to the U.S. And so at that point, there actually was a supply issue. There genuinely wasn't enough oil in the country, and people were lining up around the block and being assigned certain days that they were allowed to get gas and all of these things. And so Nixon actually put in place a ban on exporting any oil. And that was, in place for 30 years, as soon as the fracking boom kind of started, the industry started lobbying the government to lift that ban. And Obama did that in 2015. And really a lot of everything that we're dealing with now is related to that, including, our total dependency on the fossil fuel industry. So in
terms of hydraulic fracking, what is the state of this movement? Not movement. I say movement from like an industry stance, because it seems like the word is out and people, there's a sort of ban on fracking in New York State, other states, the EU. People start now seem to understand the science behind what's really happening versus say 10 years ago when it was unclear. Is oil and gas? Is there so much push for fracking, or is it like a dead industry? Yes. I guess is what I'm trying to say.
No,
is it dying?
It's booming right now. It's absolutely booming right now. Thanks to this announcement that Biden made in March with the EU saying, okay, we're going to supply a shitload of gas to Europe, and we're going to lock in demand until 2030. That is the most ridiculous, the most ridiculous decision. It doesn't have anything to do with short-term need. It locks us into this. And so now, and then they had this like sham hearing where they hauled all the executives into Congress to yell at them about price gouging at the pump, and then ended up begging them to produce more oil and gas. So, it's fucking game on for these guys right now. I just talked to someone who, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I just talked to someone who works in the Permian in Texas. That's like the big basin there. And she was like, I haven't seen this many new rigs going up this fast since like the early days of the fracking boom. It's really bad.
Doing this because, again, going back to geopolitics, this is because the EU is not is not going to rely on natural gas from Russia anymore. And so
that's right.
Biden is like, don't worry, we'll supply it across this ginormous ocean. Nothing bad could happen at all.
Exactly. Yeah. It's insane. And it's like a fucking gift for the gas guy because they had been really on the ropes. The fracking guys never actually made money off of fracking. It's like the biggest pyramid scheme ever. The only people who ever made money were early investors who made money off of late stage investors. That's it. They never had cash flow. Like they've been really, they thought lifting the export ban would help. Didn't really help.
It's like crypto.
Exactly. So then, recently when gas prices first started to go up, all the fracking guys were like, don't worry, we won't increase production because we want to actually be able to pay shareholders dividends that they've been waiting on for years. And we're going to do that instead of increasing production. That lasted for a few months. Now they're all like, okay, actually we have this demand locked until 2030, so we can go for it. The risk has been removed for us. And so they're all like, they're just, going at it really hard. And they like, again, like because of not just the fact that they weren't making money, but also the folks had kind of figured out, oh, wait a minute, gas is not actually a bridge fuel. It's not actually clean energy. there's all these problems even before you get to the climate impact with water and radioactive waste and all of these things. And so states started to pass gas bans. Cities and counties were passing them. The states were passing them. It actually caught the industry off guard for a hot minute. And then they quickly moved to pass a bunch of preemptive bans on bans. So now those exist in like 18, 19 states. And they have this great gift of this whole situation be like, actually, you're not going to get rid of us because you need us. And we're going to grow, in fact. Yeah.
So this is interesting because I think, I like to break down where our consumption comes from, where, I remember years ago, I went, it was in Los Angeles interviewing a climate researcher. And she said to me, people think all the smog comes from the cars in Los Angeles, but like, yeah, okay. In the 60s, before it was really regulated, it did affect it. But the majority of the smog was coming from the port and the ships at the port of entry right there that were coming in from China, from Asia, was actually creating the air quality conditions there. And so, I mean, that to me was really fascinating. And then, that gets to the point of, well, is the pollution really coming from our car use? Of course, there's an effect, but or is it much bigger? Is it really coming from smokestacks and, ships coming in? And obviously every city is a little bit different. I know in New York City, they put a ban on a very long fight on this. There was a city council member, Kostas Anidis, he's not there anymore, but he had pushed for a ban on natural gas in housing. And, even if you dealt with public housing, I believe 1 in 8 New Yorkers are in public housing, and retrofit it, then you would decrease pollution. That's the number one cause of pollution in New York City. So in terms of consumption, whether it's oil or natural gas, where are we using? What are the major consumers, nationwide?
Yeah, this is super interesting too, because again, the industry tries to paint this picture of like, hey, we're just supplying a demand here. Like, you guys are the ones that are addicted to our product. It's not us pushing. But actually what the IPCC report found was that, in fact, this is a product looking for a market in a lot of ways. And that so right now, actually in the US, we have seen a massive decline in fossil fuel use in both buildings and transportation, which are historically major areas. The other one is industrial, which is, all the manufacturing, all of our other consumption, right? Which is not purely connected to energy. But as it started to go down in transportation and buildings, what the industry did was shift its attention to petrochemicals and plastic. So the reason that you're seeing a massive boom in single-use plastics is not because there's an increased demand for single-use plastics. It's because the oil industry needed a place to recoup the profits it was losing on transportation and buildings. This is why I'm kind of like, look, this idea that the markets are going to solve it, or that industry needs to be at the table to like draft regulation. It's just like, come on, it's not like they're going to ever, make the decision that's best for the rest of us. They operate, as all companies do, to generate profit. And like, that's what our laws are set up to enable. So I don't even necessarily blame them, but it's like, why do we keep expecting them to behave differently? They're going to keep looking for more. That's why I'm so worried about this gas build out, because like, as soon as demand drops, they're just going to find another way to push that stuff. It's not like they're going to take that signal and produce less. They don't operate that way.
Oh, don't worry. They're just gonna push more recycling. It'll all make up for it.
Yeah.
I'll be sipping on a metal straw from underneath the ocean because climate will have impacted. My apartment will be underwater by then.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Wow. Well, what a beat. I really give you a lot of credit for being on this beat. It's quite depressing. Amy, really, really appreciate it. It's like being a COVID reporter at this point. Like there's never any good news coming.
It's true. It's true. But yeah, I try to tell people to like feel sad if you need to. That's normal. But then like get mad because it's really enraging. It's very unfair and unjust. And what these companies get away with is criminal. So people, anger's a more pleasant emotion sometimes.
And if it gives you any hope, a lot of these elected officials that are put in charge of this, they're a little old now. Their days may be done pretty soon. I'm not, because time to retire. They can't keep their thoughts together.
I can
Amy
only
Westervelt,
hope that Joe Manchin chokes on some coal dust sometimes.
How old is he? I feel like he's not old enough yet, but
It's true. It's true.
It's amazing that the climate, he's basically their warrior, and he's really ending all days for us. Thanks.
Yeah.
Amy, thank you so much for joining us. Amy Westervelt is an investigative journalist and host of the Drilled podcast and co-host of Hot Take and Scene On podcasts. You can go check out her pieces in The Intercept on the oil industry and pollution, all the things you really want to hear about right now. Very, very good having you on. And you make it so digestible also. So that's...
Oh, thank you. Thanks.
Very nice.
Thanks for having me.
Talking to our dear friend and friend of the show, the one and only Kim Kelly, who has a book out called Fight Like Hell, The Untold History of American Labor. This is so exciting. So we get to talk about the great work of the labor movement and how it's grown really since, a revival since the 60s. Oh my gosh. Okay. I'm just going to read you a little bit from this. In Fight Like Hell, Kim Kelly throws wide the doors to inspire all of us to seize power for ourselves by showing how, yesterday and today, the oppressed and overlooked, the outcasts and the misfits shaped history. That is the one and only international president of the Association of Flight Attendants, Sarah Nelson, giving an incredible quote for Kim Kelly's new book called Fight Like Hell, The Untold History of American Labor. I am so excited. I've been waiting to have this conversation. Kim Kelly is also, she's a labor reporter. You may know her from Teen Vogue. And is that a book or a poster of your book in the background, Kim?
It's a real book. They let me do a real book.
It went on sale, 3 days ago?
Today. Yeah, the 26th. It came out. They let me get away with it. Can you believe it? I can't.
How do you feel?
It's wild. Like, I'm really happy and I really hope people like it. And I am really worn out from doing all this press tour stuff, but I'm excited to talk to you because I'm like, oh my God, finally one of my friends.
Oh. Well, we love you. And hopefully everybody has been kind. Although it would be funny. I would love to see you go on a conservative show and talk about this. And yeah.
I know there's a lot of conversations around should we try and take advantage of these massive platforms that people have, like these evil demons like Tucker Carlson. I know Christian Small's got a lot of flack for going into the show. And it's definitely an interesting decision as a way to reach a lot of people. I don't think I would do well because Tucker Carlson's already yelled about me on this show before. We don't need to.
I remember that.
Hear things, right?
I think it depends on the situation. I mean, you can go on a CNBC or something like that with all the business reporters and, a Neil Cavuto on Fox Business. But Tucker's got a demonic motive. I mean, there are some people you can sway from Fox News that are not, Trumpian white supremacists, believe it or not. It's the only news in town. With that being said, it's something that requires a lot of practice and skill. And I'm not saying that you don't have it. You definitely do. It's just,
I don't have the media training for that.
Not everybody should, by the way. I always say something not everybody should be that person. There are folks who need to do deep work, and you've done incredible research here. I don't even know where to begin because there's so much to talk about. I'm like, can we do a Joe Rogan podcast and do 3 hours of this? Not Joe Rogan, our version. Okay.
There's a lot in there, and I remember most of it at this point.
So this is like, okay, this is so well needed, right? I mean, the labor movement is having a revival. There's a lot of energy. When did you start writing this book?
I started it, let's see, I think really like March or April 2020 is when I sat down. I was like, oh, I gotta write this thing now. And I started trying to write it as I would, and this is true of the entire time I was writing the damn thing. I was going back and forth from Philly, where I live, to Alabama, where I was covering first an effort by Amazon workers in Bessemer to organize and to try and unionize there. And then I got sucked into this coal miner strike down the road in Brookwood. And I think I lost track of the amount of time I've been back and forth. So I was like doing all this research and sitting in my little office, like being a little gremlin, typing this book up for half the time. And the rest of the time I was going down to Alabama into this very current and alive labor conflict. It was definitely an interesting experience.
And at that time, did you feel like there was something different than, a traditional strike that may not be getting attention the way now a lot of strikes are?
Oh, and with the folks in Alabama?
Yeah.
Maybe still on strike. They're out here year two. They eclipsed Pittston. I mean, there's a lot of factors in that strike that have really drawn my interest. And of course, I've become so close with some of the people involved that it's become kind of personal. I'm like, oh, they're my friends. Like, now I need to make sure that people know what my friends are up to and that they get a good contract. But I think something about that strike that has always stuck out to me is the fact that it hasn't gotten as much attention as so many other strikes because of who the workers are and because of assumptions about who they are and assumptions around what they believe or who they voted for or, what they're actually fighting for. And it just goes to show that there's a lot of ignorance around what's happening in more rural areas, maybe in the deep South or in the Midwest or in the Northeast, or not the Northeast, the Northwest. Like, there were so many incredibly important and interesting labor struggles happening around the country all the time, like not just New York, not just LA, though they're also important. Like, it just kind of solidified this idea for me that, like, oh wow, there's literally stuff happening everywhere all the time. There just aren't enough labor reporters, not enough labor friendly publications there to cover them all. So at least I can stick with this one.
But I mean, but you say New York and LA, I mean, those are media towns. So even though the Buffalo Starbucks workers were not in New York City, it's fascinating because it may have in a weird way boosted this existing work that you've been working on independently. Now there are more labor reporters, or more, at least there's more labor interest.
It's been wild over the past, like, I guess 2 years since I sat down to do this, and I'm talking to you here today. Like, it's kind of driven me a little crazy, like, as a reporter, because I'm like, well, I can't go and cover the Kellogg strike, the John Deere strike. Like, Striketober is passing me by because I have to finish this chapter. But it was so gratifying and so just wonderful to see how many people are covering these stories now. I've gotten interested in these stories, whether it's brand new labor reporters or other reporters who have become interested in the beat. Like, it seems like there's so many more of us now, and it's such a wonderful thing to see because, like, they're never going to be enough to tell every story that needs to be told. But we're in a hell of a better place than even when I started like 5 or 6 years ago.
That's incredible. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about, I don't know where we begin. Let's say, like, what has happened since the early 60s and how labor has evolved, whether, actually in terms of like actual organized labor, maybe as the politics of the country has changed. I think folks are very familiar with Reagan and how the Democratic Party has disassociated itself with labor in many ways in the last, 40 years. But how does that, let's juxtapose the movement, the actual labor organizing with the politics of the time. And I'll just like leave it to you. We'll just kind of build, because there is a lot in this book and I don't even know where to, at this point, to begin.
I mean, the 60s and 70s were such an incredibly important and like such a vibrant and vital time for organizing, especially in spaces where there were more marginalized workers who were trying to make things happen. Like one of my favorite chapters, The Prisoners, goes into the legacy and past and present of incarcerated workers organizing. In the 70s, there was this explosion of prisoners organizing unions within prisons. And in some cases, they were able to work with organized labor outside the walls. And they're kind of like gaining some ground. There are chapters of various prisoners' labor unions across the country. And the Supreme Court came in and was like, oh, no. You can't be doing all that. There are a bunch of legal things that happened before that, right? But essentially in 1977, a Supreme Court ruled Jones versus North Carolina Prisoners Labor Union basically ruled that people in prison who are working don't have the right to join and organize a union. Like every other worker, well, not every other worker in this country, right? But like so many other workers in this country, they are denied that, even though they go to work and they have a boss and sometimes make a tiny bit of money. They can't clock out and they're not, they lost that right. But the workers kept organizing anyway. And I guess that's just one example of how the state has gotten in the way of workers trying to organize. And the book is like kind of sort of chronological, but not in like in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s.
Right.
I kind of pick out different pieces and try to show how different struggles intersected. So I mean, if there's anything specific that jumps out to you that's interesting, or any specific like political fail that jumps out to you too, like I'm down to get into it.
I mean, this is okay. So let's. Oh God.
Put you on the spot.
I know the problem is we don't have 2 hours. And no, it's fine.
No,
I marked
right?
it up, but I'm just like, I really should have had questions. Like, I never do this because it's usually just a rolling conversation, but there really is a lot. Okay, so
no, it's way more fun this way because there's a lot of folks that I've talked to have had like very specific questions about like specific dates or specific strikes, and I'm like, thank you for asking that. Let me check real quick because like I said, there's so much stuff in here. And I wrote it like a year ago and so much has happened. Like a lot of interviews, folks have asked me about the Amazon Labor Union, which has been really fun to learn more about. But like there are a lot of reporters like Lauren Gurley and Louis Leon, Maximilian Alvarez, like people who have been following that really closely. So I'm always like, just go read what they had to say and I'll give you my like nerdy, historically based take after.
Because it's in the moment. So I'll start with the beginning because this is what my personal I think this is lost in the conversation. I'm really glad that you led with women, just how important women have been to labor and still are, by the way, which is why I think this is great.
We're out here.
You've dedicated a few chapters to this, quite a few. I love it. I think people know about the garment workers in New York. I
would hope.
Well, I should say. I think people.
That's one of the big ones, right? Like a lot of people, like I feel like the big ones that people know about are maybe the Triangle Factory Fire. Yeah. Maybe people know Cesar Chavez. Maybe they know like something about auto workers, but that's kind of the broad strokes that most people who aren't invested in this stuff or aren't actively studying it know. So I was like, well, let me pull out all these other interesting things and slap them in there. And hopefully we can get, just not raise awareness, but just teach people about our history. Because so much, it hasn't been lost. Like a lot of brilliant historians and academics and researchers have preserved it and have done really incredible work, digging into that. But it's not that easily accessible. Like there aren't that many radical labor histories sitting around Barnes and Noble.
Right.
Well, there's one now. But
for now.
Yeah, for now. Hopefully there'll be a whole lot more because this is kind of just the beginning. I hope people pick this up and dig into the bibliography, which is like this thick, and find new threads to pull and new books and authors to explore. Because this is like, I could only fit so much. I fit a lot, but I think we had about like 40,000 words cut because I showed up with this draft. My editor was like, that's like 3 extra trees worth. Like we can't be doing all that.
Oh my God. It's so funny you say that about Barnes & Noble. I was in Europe. Was this last year? I can't even talk because this pandemic is like confusing. But I was in Europe and I love going to bookstores in Europe because they're just so much better. They're like, there's a stark difference. You can find books on labor and much stuff that's really hard to find in the US because even if you go on, and I hate to say Amazon, there's a reason you can't find it on Amazon because it's not, complimentary.
It's just not a topic. Like I think of like one of my favorite bookstores, Houseman's in London. They have like a whole labor section. And it's like in the front. It's like right there. It's like, oh yeah, of course people should have access to this history. It should be easy to find. It's like,
exactly.
But I guess it's like this is my like conspiracy brain, right? Where it's like, well,
no, it's true.
The people in power don't want us to know about how powerful we are because then they're gonna
No, that's exactly what it is. I was in Scotland. I came back and I went to Barnes and Noble for something and killing time. And what I see that was like the suggested picks versus what I saw in Scotland was like Andrew Cuomo's pandemic book. And I'm like, and just like how to get rich and like all the bullshit American. Like, if you really want to understand,
there's a business section or a self-help section, but there's not like a labor history section or a people's history section. Like business, business isn't, who wants to know about business? That's boring.
And the people who are making money off of it, they're in their own little circle and they all went to like the same business schools.
Yeah, they're not shopping at Barnes and Noble.
They're not traveling to Barnes and Noble. I do want to talk about the New Deal and labor. And
my girl Frances.
Yes. So I think there's a lot of folks who, the New Deal is critically important. But there's a lot of criticisms also of the New Deal, leaving out many people of color in many capacities. But there's an overlap with labor, I guess. I don't want to give it all away. But how do you feel the New Deal and labor dealt with women, people of color, marginalized communities, given the criticism, like the big picture criticisms of the New Deal?
So, I'm not a New Deal scholar, so I'm sure you know more about than I do. But in terms of what I cover, yeah, I mean, they're doing my best out here, right? But in terms of the New Deal and the way that I kind of cover and approach it in the book, I kind of approach it through the lens of Frances Perkins, who was just this incredible. I actually, man, speaking of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, I'm in New York right now. And we walked by the plaque that they have on the Brown Building, like where the tragedy happened. And of course, there's construction. I couldn't get close to it. Yeah, like people should be able to check that out. But that was just kind of nice. I was like, oh, I know you. You remember? But Frances Perkins was this woman who I think she's probably about my age when this happened. She happened to be in New York visiting a friend when the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire happened, and she witnessed it. She could, hear the screams and smell the burning flesh. Like it had an indelible impact on her. And she was already involved in, she worked for like the Consumer Protection League, something like that, like trying to help out consumers. And she was already interested in social justice and workers' issues. But that kind of changed the trajectory of her whole life. And she became involved in local politics and like different regulatory committees and agencies trying to help with workplace safety and fire safety specifically. And, she did a whole bunch of stuff, but the big thing that she did, she ended up being appointed to the cabinet as the first female cabinet member in general, and definitely the first Secretary of Labor. And she was a huge, she was one of the architects of the New Deal. Like a lot of that came from her. Like she's the one who came up with Social Security. And she was also just involved in all of the worker centric parts of it. Like that was her whole thing. And like one of the big, and I think she's just an incredibly fascinating person to read more about. But something that happened during that era was we got some of these labor laws. We got some things that were helpful in a way, but like you said, still left people out. Like we're still dealing with the after effects of that. Like talk about the National Labor Relations Act, 1935. That was a big deal. That has made it much easier for workers to collectively organize and bargain, but not everybody. It left out several specific categories of workers. One, independent contractors, which is just like, that's a mess.
And how much, just for folks, like independent contractors, then was it as large of did we see in the same way as we do now?
I don't really know. Like, I don't know as much about the history of that specific classification. I'd love to learn more about it because like, it sucks being one. And I love how we got into this mess, right? But two of the other groups that were left out explicitly and on purpose, domestic workers and agricultural workers. And at that time, those workers were generally Black women and Black men. And they were cut out because Southern lawmakers who were racist did not want those workers to have those rights, to be able to organize, to be able to build power. So the only way that they could pass that bill was to cut out these more vulnerable workers. And we're still seeing the after effects of that now. And it's kind of like, history rhyming, right? Like the only way we can pass some very useful legislation is to leave a bunch of people out. Right. Wild how we, it seems like they still love doing that.
Shocker. You do touch on the racism that occurred during the time. We don't have a ton of time. There's just so much going on. There's a lot in this book. It's really phenomenal. Okay, so the Pullman Railway Porters. I can't say it. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, A. Philip Randolph helped form the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which was I think it's the first Black-led, predominantly Black labor union that was recognized as part of. I'm not sure when they incorporated with the AFL. But yeah, they're a big deal. We'll just say that they're a big deal. You can read more about in the book, but they were representing Pullman porters who worked on the Pullman Company's fancy sleeper cars. And all of those workers were Black men. And that was intentional because that's I'll get into it more in the book. I don't want to give too much away. Shout out to Joseph Pullman. What a dick. Basically, yeah, it was like the most, these workers really needed a voice in the job. They really needed some help dealing with like the low wages and the outright racism and just all of the garbage that came with working in that environment, serving predominantly white moneyed passengers. And that union was like, that was a huge deal that made a big impact on labor movement. And a lot of people involved in that union went on to be involved in other struggles, whether it's in labor and the civil rights movement. And one part of that struggle that stood out to me that I wanted to dig into was the fact that there are also Black women that worked on the Pullman cars, the Pullman maids. And the union, which is run by men, didn't really have their back. It kind of cut them out. It didn't really advocate for them or include them the way that it stood up for the men. And it just kind of goes to show that even within these, incredibly necessary and progressive labor organizations that have such, sweeping and crucial goals, like some people still got left out. And I wanted to, there are a bunch of great books about it. Melinda Chateauver has a great book just specifically about them. But yeah, it just kind of shows one of the big lessons I learned in my book, and hopefully readers will learn, like there's always someone who got left out and they had to figure things out on their own. But a lot of times they did it, you know?
But the Pullman, this labor effort in the beginning, it really was critical for a rising Black middle class, as you stated.
Yeah, that was like because obviously at that time, like there weren't a lot of options for Black men to get good jobs. Like they're stuck doing the dirtiest, lowest paying, most dangerous work. And to work as a Pullman porter, it was still really hard work. There was a lot of discrimination and racism and like the mental strain and anguish of that. But it still at that time was seen as kind of the best gig going. Like if you're a Pullman porter, like you could pass that position down to your son. Like you could build something for your family in a way that hadn't been accessible before. And the union was a big part of making that such a strong option for folks.
Okay, before we wrap, I want to talk about, because I know our audience is going to be interested in this, red baiting. Everyone loves to talk about red baiting. So McCarthyism was obviously a big factor in this, but how did that influence organizing internally?
Oh man, there's so many instances like in the book and just throughout labor history of like these just like incredibly effective and beloved and radical organizers and rank and file worker leaders who just because like they were socialists or anarchists or communists, they're part of the wrong party, had the wrong card in their wallet. They were blacklisted, they were intimidated, they were abused, they're run out of the movement entirely. And it's just like, it's not funny. It's just so absurd because like so many of the most important organizers in labor history in the US have been socialists and anarchists and communists. Like, of course, it's the radicals who are willing to put everything on the line and to push for a better future. Like, you kind of have to have a little bit of that big sky thinking if you're going to try and go from like point A to point Z, like the way that so many of these workers have had to. I think about, I wrote about her more for The Nation. I couldn't squeeze her in as much as I wanted to, but just a organizer named Emma Tenayuka, who was really involved in a pecan sheller strike in Texas. And I think it was the 30s. And she was just an incredibly effective organizer who was blacklisted and like moved out of town because her family was being threatened because she was a communist. And like, it's just such an absurd thing that so few people who don't already have an interest or a stake in learning more about it, like so few people know how important like radicals have been to the history of this country, even like, and like the best stuff, like all the stuff the Democrats like to take credit for, like they could call me for that, honestly.
That's like hashtag. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting though, because like they were even driven out of unions. I mean, this is, I think especially in context of where we are today and in understanding how labor can be disrupted and people can be smeared. I mean, we've seen these efforts with Christian Smalls. Obviously, it was a very big story. How the emails that were sent out about him, but also just elected officials. Like on the electoral side, it is a great way to divide and conquer and ostracize folks. They're still using the same tactics. but I think the conditions are just ripe for more organizing. And you've really laid out a great toolkit, I guess, is read your history, understand your history, essential reading. Oh my God, I want to talk about this more. I hope to have you. Well, you're on all the time, but maybe next time I'll just like find one chapter because there's so much.
Yeah.
I can't.
There's like so much I couldn't fit in there because like thankfully there's so many brilliant historians who have done so much deeper digging into this that like I wanted to squeeze in everything, and there's so much I don't know still that I'm still continuing to research and continue to learn about this stuff. So you can imagine like it just never ends, right? Like the people's history, there's never a stopping point because we're living through it right now.
Exactly. Well, that means you're going to have many books. So
when people buy this one, they'll say.
Go buy it. Wait, I have the mirrored thing here right now, so I can't even fight like hell. There you go. Don't buy it on Amazon or Barnes and Noble. Go buy it from your
Bookshop.
local indie. What bookshelf is that? What you want?
Bookshop.org. It's
Bookshop.
It's a way that you
There it is,
can
yeah.
support independent booksellers and indie bound, like beg, borrow, steal, order it from your library. I love the library thing. Some people have done that too.
Yeah, but you also have to make money. So
yeah, I just want people to read it.
oh.
That's
Spoken like a true progressive. I just want people to read it. I don't want to.
I wrote it for people to read on their break or on the bus. Like this is our history, and we deserve to know about it.
Go check it out. Essential reading, summertime reading if you have a vacation. Good stuff. And it also, the other thing is, it's like it's super informative, but it reads well. Like you're a great storyteller. I should have led with that.
Appreciate that. I tried to make it fun because no one's going to want to sit here and read a 300-page history book if there isn't a little, pizzazz in there.
Well, you're all pizzazz. Kim Kelly, thank you as always for joining us. Go check out Fight Like Hell. Indie booksellers, that's where you got to find them. If you are lucky enough to have an independent bookstore that's could sell it, you can also order it from there because we have one in our neighborhood. And when they don't have books, I say, can you order this? And they love when I do that.
Yeah.
So you can also do that too. Make sure to demand that they bring it forward and not like 9,000 copies of an RBG like picture book. Every indie bookseller in New York is like, there's like an RBG picture book in it.
And support union booksellers, there's a lot of those out there now.
Exactly.
Booksellers are workers too. We're all in it together.
Indeed. Kim Kelly, thank you so much for joining us. Good luck with the book tour.
Thank you.
All right. See you next time. All right. We will be right back after this quick break.
Keep on saying that in your bill you will help kids. So exactly how are you going to help kids? What the help?
With therapy. We want to treat these children, and a lot of them have underlying reasons, underlying problems. In the medical field, if you have an infection and that infection gets so bad, you become septic where that infection has spread to your bloodstream. And so doctors don't just start throwing antibiotics or medicine at you. They find the root cause of that infection. And so the root cause of a lot of this gender dysphoria is abuse, sexual abuse, depression, anxiety, different things like autism or obsessive compulsive disorders, social contagions. There's all kinds of root causes that we need better therapy to get to the basis of.
I will always agree on therapy because I believe that therapy is needed for everybody. But I do not believe that comparing these kids who believe that they're not in the right body. I do not believe comparing them to an infection. And I do not think that they have a whole bunch of the underlying diseases that you've just said.
I investigated child abuse and neglect for a really long time. I'm a licensed master social worker. This is my background. So I'm telling you that trauma is not indicative of having a different gender identity. That's not interchangeable. That is not something, there's not direct correlation there.
But is that being thoroughly evaluated when they treat them? When they
Do
see
they go
a
through
counselor
psychological
one time?
evaluations?
They go one time and then they get referred to the gender clinic.
Okay. So are you aware of any therapy that happens prior to that? Do you not think that
I've
parents
heard
are
stories right here in Missouri where they're
Okay.
not. They go to a
Okay.
counselor with confusion and they're
Uh-huh.
automatically referred
Are-
to a gender clinic.
are you in those therapy sessions?
No, and
Okay.
and we're not allowed to know what happens.
Right, because those are confidential.
right, they're
Right.
private.
Okay.
Confidential, because those are confidential. Oh boy. All right. That was a clip of, oh my gosh, a Missouri State Representative Pollock, Republican, of course, presenting her anti-trans Save Adolescents from Experimentation bill, saying youth questioning their gender is like an infection that becomes septic, and that autism may be an underlying cause. I'm confused. What's the underlying cause here? All right, this is just one of the many examples of the right wing's total brain. I don't even know what's going. I don't know if any of these people actually believe it, or they just realize that they need a culture war to win, and to go after folks of any type. And maybe, you know, in some cases it's a 1-2 punch. Go after people's healthcare. Of course, put the trans community in danger. You know, make the parents more conservative. I don't know. They've got a lot of strategies, of course, taking on education. You're watching it. It's happening all over the country. This is a movement now by the right. Aaron Reed tracks anti-trans legislation all over the country and runs the largest trans healthcare map, an informed consent map listing every informed consent hormone therapy clinic for trans people. And you can go check out Aaron's TikTok at Aaron in the Morn. Aaron, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And yeah, that was, like you mentioned, that was Representative Pollock. And at that same hearing, later on, just like a few minutes later, they brought on a witness who was actually a conversion therapist. And they asked her how she would treat the trans kids in Missouri. And conversion therapy was their go-to. Like she had stated that.
I can't even at this point. Like,
it's pretty ridiculous.
This is insane. Okay, so let's just start off with you. You have this map. When did you start it? How do you go about tracking? Because I imagine, you know, some of these efforts are underway kind of behind the scenes before they go public. So how do you go about this process?
Are you referring to the informed consent map right here? Yes. And so 3 years ago, whenever I had originally transitioned, I had heard that there was something called informed consent HRT clinics. These are clinics that you can go to that are not gate-kept behind 2 years of therapy, real life experience, basically how they used to do things with transition about 2 years ago. Because not everybody can afford to spend thousands and thousands of dollars on therapy before they're allowed to transition and obtain their hormones. The thing is that these clinics were not in a centralized repository or one place. A lot of times they're just word of mouth. So you go on Reddit, you go on forums that are on the internet, you look for resources that are put out by local organizations that list them, but they weren't put in one place. And so about a year after my transition, I realized that like I had to do a lot of searching to find my map or to find my location that I go to. And so I figured I would just spend some time and like go through and all of these resources, put them on a Google Maps and just share it publicly. So after sharing it publicly, a lot of people they started giving their own clinics, and it became kind of a community resource rather than just something that I put in there. And it's just become this large list of like 800 clinics. It's been viewed, I think, 2.2 million times.
This is incredible. It really is an incredible amount of research. So, you know, you track the legislation, the right wing, the attacks on the trans community. We hear almost every day, like a new bill comes out, a new hearing, a new tweet. Is there a sense at this point how many bills are in the works? Okay, you have that.
Yeah, so there's a lot of numbers out there because the thing is that these bills are being brought up every day. They're dying every day. And then there are some from the previous year that kind of can still be considered alive right now. Numbers that I hear range between 150 and 250 bills, the most in the history of the United States in terms of anti-LGBT legislation. And you're right, they are popping up every day. I think that like right now you played the one from the Missouri hearing. That one is currently in the stables. Like it may be about to go to the Senate and to the House in Missouri and pass it. There was, a pronoun bill that popped up in Tennessee recently that would have given teachers in Tennessee the right to misgender your students, but only if you're transgender. So like they couldn't misgender or cisgender students. It's literally just directed at trans students. There are bills that are popping up in Alabama, just passed one recently, where so this was crazy. They just had one bill, and it was a bill to detransition trans youth, which passed in Alabama. However, they then substituted another bill to become a bathroom ban. So trans people that are in schools as well as teachers can't go to the restroom of their gender identity. And then added to that at the last minute, a don't say gay bill. So, they just kind of like, they're putting everything together.
Everything.
And
then abortion bans too. There's just this list of like everything on top of it. Like,
and I'm glad that you mentioned abortion bans, because the thing is that the same organizations that are going after, transgender and LGBT people are the same ones that are going after abortion. And so, you have ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, ADF, the Alliance Defending Freedom. Both of them are pushing these laws.
I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because that was where I wanted to go, is who are the messaging is like almost, it's not just like, oh, Tucker Carlson says it on TV and then everybody mimics it, or Laura Ingraham or whoever. It really does seem to be like there's lawmakers all over the country who have a set of talking points, may not even understand how to defend them, as we just saw. But it's coming from somewhere. Where ALEC is an incredible tool for the right wing to spread, and the Koch brothers to spread their agenda, and especially using culture wars now. But do you know like is this coming out of the Heritage Foundation? Is there like a specific group that has lobbied very hard to make trans issues the big culture issue of our time? I mean, culture, I'm saying in their terms, not ours. It's a human rights issue, in my perspective. Do you think that is there like one group that was really behind this, that felt like this is where they had to go?
So it's weird. There's a web, and it's a pretty big network of groups that are involved. But the two that you always hear are, like I just mentioned, ALEC and ADF, the Alliance Defending Freedom. Alliance Defending Freedom, their hands are in everything. And the thing is that they actually have, it's a very strange sort of cross-pollination with the United Kingdom's wave of trans exclusionary radical feminism, so TERFism, in the United Kingdom. And so they're borrowing some of the things that are coming from there. And they're actually, it's really strange, but they're actually financially donating to groups like the Women's WOLF, the Women's Liberation Front. And these are people who on their face, if you just look at their mission statements and such, you wouldn't imagine that they would be fitting with each other, because, ADF is in favor of banning abortion and has lobbied for SB 8 in Texas, whereas WOLF has been, they're ostensibly a feminist organization. However, they're getting money and they're using the same arguments, and they're actually creating resources together. Like they've branded Understanding Gender Dysphoria in Children, like this guidebook, and it has ADF branding and it's got like WOLF branding, and it's just the strangest thing to see with one another.
Do we have a sense of the funding? Like, are there a group of donors that seem to be pushing this through these different organizations?
The funding is really dark, and yeah. I have not researched too much into the funding. I know that it's hard to get a grasp for who is giving the money to ADF and all these other organizations that are out there. And they don't really report a lot on this stuff.
In terms of polling, Fox News and the right wing can make issues a thing, and suddenly, like now everyone's talking about pedophilia, which is,
the groomer stuff has been pretty intense.
Yeah. So I feel like Democrats or progressive, well, Democrats in particular, like Center Dems, will pull something before they champion it. I feel like the far right invents something and then makes the polls move. Have you seen, in terms of polling, say 10 years ago, when, I don't even know, when did the first the trans bathroom bills, when did those
2015-ish, that
2015, not even that long,
give or take a year, yeah.
Was that the first big issue that was
it was
national?
It was, and there was a clear blow up against that issue at the time. You had a lot of organizations that pulled out of North Carolina, which ended up sinking that bill. They pulled back pretty heavily. On the left, there is a strong sense of caring for these issues. However, there hasn't been a well-sustained pushback among Democrats for these bills.
Do you think there's do you think that's because they realize they can win on the right and they can go to war with Democrats and basically push them into fighting these issues that they've invented because they have control of the legislature, because it's like, oh, here's how and this is the most ruthless way as a Republican, strategist might be thinking, well, Republicans are going to do whatever we want them to do no matter what, even if they care about it or don't. But Democrats care about this. So let's go after them on this, have them use their resources. And in the meantime, we can chip away at the rights of trans people, women who are seeking abortions, and in the case of CRT, you've got people of color and teachers. So let's just go for them all at once.
Totally, absolutely, and that's 100% part of it. But I don't think that it's the whole story, because in states where they have a massive majority, so we're talking like my state of Maryland or Hawaii, there are these bills that would offer equal healthcare protections, for instance, to transgender people. And in Maryland, the bill got spiked at the last moment. In Hawaii, which is literally 24 Democrat, 1 Republican, there is currently a healthcare bill that, if passed, would make life so much better and so much easier for the trans people in Hawaii. And that bill is currently sitting in conference committee. It's been delayed twice. Right now, at this moment, I think they're probably going to be discussing it. And I mean, I don't want to see that bill get spiked either. So, I mean, yes, I think that that's part of it. But I think even in places where we ostensibly have a lot of allies, we still need help. We still need those bills to pass. We still need people to act at home.
And I wonder, is this because maybe there's Democrats who think that there are more culturally conservative Democrats that they need to win still?
Very possibly, but like 24-1, like you can pass that and still get rid of like half of your Democrats, and still whereas in the meanwhile, we see a poll like the Civics poll that shows 72% of Democrats find transgender issues to be important to them. Like even in places where they're not going to risk anything, like there's no risk, we can't get the bills passed. And so I think that there is an issue of, having spoken to some of the people doing the work on the ground, a lot of Democrats are simply uncomfortable. A lot of legislators are simply uncomfortable with trans topics. Like I've spoken to them, and like they've talked about how going to these legislators, speaking to them, they've got to work through a lot of really basic questions and a lot of uncomfortable moments, and they still get the response of the kind of response that you'd expect sometimes from Republicans, where they're just like, I just don't know how I feel about this, that kind of stuff.
A lot of education still have. So
a lot of education to be done. Seriously.
A lot. And I learned something. I've seen some stories on TikTok, especially just how difficult a day in the life of someone who's trans is, because of a lot of the legislation, because of a lot of ridiculous rules. Let's play this clip of the airport.
Sure.
I know you're like, oh yeah, I know. I'm like, what? Let's play this clip.
If you're cisgender, did you know that most transgender people have to arrive to the airport 15 minutes earlier than you in order to get there at the same time? This is just one of many time taxes that apply to being trans. If you don't understand, I'll explain. Airport body scanners are built under the assumption that your anatomy matches your gender presentation. So when it doesn't, it's going to think you're smuggling a bomb. Watch this.
The TSA officer will press a button designating a gender based on how you present yourself, male or female.
So this is clearly pretty ridiculous, but this is what a lot of transgender people have to go through when they go to the airport. And in fact, if you read the TSA guidance for transgender people, it literally says to get there early. So recently, the federal government said that they would change these machines. However, Lauren Boebert just filed a bill to block those changes. It really sucks to know that there's an entire political party dedicated to making life harder for trans people.
So this is like the time tax is incredible. Erin, what other examples do you have of how your life is just like more inconvenient and difficult because obviously there's legislation like Lauren Boebert wanting to block any sort of basic switch. I mean, like that's not difficult for TSA to do. They don't care. But Lauren Boebert's like, no, I'm going to punish you.
Yeah. And, it's not a huge deal to change these machines and the algorithms. I actually have spoken to some of the programmers. One of the programmers that's involved is transgender herself, and so that's, you know, it's not a huge deal, but they're still trying to block it, and there's no policy objective that serves it. Literally is just designed to make life harder. But there are like a lot of other things that people might take for granted that end up taking a whole lot longer, just because, you know, my gender identity doesn't match what I was assigned at birth. So my birth certificate is a huge deal. Like my birth certificate having my dead name on it and having my old gender on it. Anytime that like I need to prove that I am my son's parent and I have my driver's license as my current name, but you know, like I have to show on his birth certificate and it's got my old name on it, I have to then like bring out my name change documents, bring out like a whole lot of other things. Same with like my passports. You know, I'm trying to get my passport right now, and in order to do that, you have to send in your birth certificate, which is pretty trivial for a lot of people, but because my birth certificate doesn't match my current name, I've got to also send in a lot of other stuff, and I got to gather them from different places, which also then costs money. And a lot of times, you know, it'd be a lot easier if I could just send in my birth certificate. Like that'd be so much easier. But because I'm from Louisiana, the policies around changing your birth certificate are very difficult. And so in order for me to change my name and my birth certificate, being from Louisiana, I have to fly out to Louisiana. I have to appear in front of a judge in my home county, which my home county is like an 87% Trump county, and judges are elected. And so it's going to be a rough like deal, and I'm going to do it. Like I'm planning on it, and I'm working on making those reservations. COVID kind of slowed things down for me on that front. But yeah, like there's all kinds of things that, you know, you just kind of run into.
And in terms of voting, are there any issues? I mean, we know how Republicans love to go after any sort of person that does not fit their white supremacist like dreamscape in terms of voting, but specifically, you know, marginalized communities and people of color. Given that, I mean, there are voter ID laws that exist in many parts of the country now. Does that affect your ability
totally
to vote?
I mean, because, you know, like I know that a lot of times trans people might be stuck filing like a provisional ballot or something because of the fact that their driver's license doesn't match their birth certificate, which doesn't match what they have on file at the voting place. And if you move from one state to another state and you still have your old state driver's license, like there's all kinds of issues. I know that, for instance, college students can vote where they go to college at, but college students, like somebody in a red state that comes from Maryland, where you can change your gender and your driver's license by attestation, might then go to like Nebraska or something where they have different laws around that. And so if they try to go and vote and they present their voter ID, the voter ID doesn't match, you know, the records, then, you know, things can get really messy.
And we take all this stuff so much for granted. And this is why I think your work is so powerful, and that you're informing people and really pulling back the curtain so folks understand just how many of these laws are across the country. Also providing information for the trans community in that you have this incredible map that you've been working on for a few years now, but also just like your TikTok. It's really like, this is how you take action. This is what's happening. Did you know this? It's really incredibly informative, and I would love to have you back on to talk more. I know that this issue, the Republicans are just going to keep going. So
it's not going to end.
There's more to fight on. Before we wrap, who is there, like, I know it's happening all over the country, but is there like one state or maybe like one representative that we should really keep our eye on?
Right now, I think that the big, oh God, there are a few, like even narrowing it down to one. Okay, so for instance, right now, Texas, Greg Abbott and Paxton, child abuse. They're trying to enforce being trans as child abuse, but also in Florida with the governor of Florida just releasing a guidance that says that youth should be banned from social transition, and that's the next big scary one that I see. This goes beyond just like hormone therapy or anything. This is like literally telling kids that they can't present as anything other than their gender at birth.
And what does that even mean? Like
haircuts, like that's all it is. Haircuts and clothes and pronouns, like for most.
And how do you associate like, the guy in a kilt? Like, does that count? No, I don't know.
Right,
who
exactly.
Who decides?
Right, it's dumb.
Are you gonna go after Harry Styles? Like, what? I don't know.
Right.
All right, Aaron Reed, it's absurd, but it's dangerous. That's why the Republicans are so scary. It seems so ridiculous, except they're actually accomplishing these things.
Yep.
Dystopian times that we live in. Aaron, thank you so much for joining us. Really, really fascinating conversation.
Anytime.
Go check out Aaron in the Morn, Twitter and TikTok. And of course, we've got the links for the map up there and the resources that you've provided. Really appreciate you joining us for Femme Friday and hope to have you back again soon.
Totally. Thank you for having me.
All right. All right, guys. Well, as usual, this is Femme Friday. We are looking forward to hearing you next Wednesday for Femme Friday. If you haven't already done so, make sure you've liked and subscribed us. Subscribe to us on all the different platforms. That includes Twitch. Go check us out on Twitch. That also includes YouTube, of course. YouTube, the world of algorithms that don't benefit anybody that's not a fascist, which we've talked about enough. And if you're not already following us on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, go check us out over there. All different things. On Facebook, it's just Nomiki Const. On Twitter, it's The Nomiki Show. On Instagram, it's The Nomiki Show. Go check us out there. And in the meantime, have a wonderful weekend. We will see you on Wednesday. And as always, stay in solidarity.
The Nomiki Show. The Nomiki Show. Yeah, We clash momentarily for class solidarity. Cash circulating, give the masses back its currency. Greed from elites, oligarchs stay fed. Deep state, fake fed, everybody break bread. Racism, homophobia, sexism, religion in this melting pot we live in. Time to build a new system, unionize labor rights. Highlight the issue, talking heads left is best. The saga continues. The Nomiki Show. The Nomiki Show. The Nomiki Show. The Nomiki Show.